Imagine yourself off the coast of Japan on a seemingly ordinary day in early 1945. The sky is clear, the Pacific waters relatively calm. An elderly fisherman who had spent his entire life gazing at this very horizon looks up from his small boat and feels an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. Something in the air had shifted, something he couldn't articulate, but that his deepest psyche immediately recognized as the harbinger of a world's end. It was there, in that moment of unconscious clairvoyance, that the old fisherman became the first vessel for what Carl Jung would call a synchronistic manifestation, the convergence of an internal psychic state and an external material event. For on the horizon, emerging like specters from a collective nightmare, the outlines of the greatest naval force the world had ever seen began to appear, the United States Navy's Third Fleet. This wasn't just any fleet. With over 100 warships, including aircraft carriers that seemed like floating cities, the so-called Ghost Fleet emerged from the Pacific fog as a physical manifestation of what Jung would describe as the archetype of overwhelming power, a force that transcends rational comprehension and directly impacts the most primitive and instinctual layers of the psyche. For Japan, which for centuries had carefully cultivated the myth of its island invulnerability, that site represented something far deeper than a military threat. It was the total collapse of a collective psychic structure. The statistics are staggering and reveal the magnitude of the psychological shock. The aircraft aboard that fleet alone numbered over 1,500, a figure that surpassed the entire operational Japanese Air Force at that moment. For a people who, until recently, devoutly believed in the divine protection of their kamis and the invincibility of their national spirit, Yamato Damashi, this manifestation of American might was not merely an impending military defeat. It was an ontological earthquake. The encounter with the shadow is always a confrontation with what we do not want to see in ourselves, Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols. And what Japan saw in that fleet was its own collective shadow, all the repressed doubts about its superiority, all the silenced fears about its vulnerability, all the arrogance that preceded the inevitable fall. When the first bombs began to fall, they weren't just destroying factories and ports. They were disintegrating the very fabric of Japanese psychic reality. An account from a Japanese naval officer recovered from his diary vividly illustrates this psychic collapse. "We saw the sky darken with American planes. There was nowhere to hide, no way to fight them. It was as if the gods themselves had abandoned us." This experience, in Jungian terms, represents what we might call a negative hierophony, the manifestation of a transcendental force that, instead of revealing the divine, unveils the absolutely terrifying. Can you imagine what it means for an entire culture to have its most fundamental certainties disintegrated in a matter of days? What would it be like to witness the dissolution of the founding myths that uphold national identity? For the average Japanese citizen, raised in the absolute certainty of the emperor's divine protection, literally considered a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, the appearance of that impossible fleet represented an unprecedented spiritual crisis. What made the Ghost Fleet particularly devastating for the Japanese psyche was its apparent invulnerability. Despite knowing its approximate position, the Japanese were virtually incapable of effectively attacking it. This forced impotence created what Jung would call a collective inferiority complex, a deep narcissistic wound to national pride that demanded psychic compensation. It's here that we begin to observe the fascinating phenomenon of the kamikaze missions, which, from a Jungian perspective, represent a desperate attempt to restore psychic balance through ritualistic self-sacrifice. When consciousness confronts the intolerable, the unconscious produces symbols of transcendence, Jung observed in Psychology and Alchemy. The kamikazes were exactly that. a symbolic attempt to transcend material impotence through an act of complete surrender. The kamikaze pilot, in his final dive against the American ships, wasn't just executing a military tactic. He was participating in a ritual of death and transfiguration, magically seeking to restore the cosmic order disturbed by the presence of that impossible fate. The statistics reveal the magnitude of this psychic despair. Over 3,800 young Japanese pilots deliberately launched themselves against American ships. What does this tell us about the collective mental state of a nation? Carl Jung helps us understand. When an intolerable situation offers no way out, the unconscious takes over. The Japanese collective unconscious, confronted with total annihilation, produced this unique phenomenon as a desperate attempt at psychic reequilibration. Meanwhile, in Japanese coastal cities, another psychological phenomenon was manifesting. Accounts from the time describe a strange atmosphere of fatalistic acceptance mixed with disbelief. One woman, interviewed decades later, recalled, "We saw the ships on the horizon, we saw the planes in the sky, but somehow we couldn't believe they were real. It was as if we were all in a shared nightmare." This description aligns perfectly with what Jung would call mystical participation, a primitive state of consciousness where the distinction between subject and object, between psyche and external world, becomes blurred. If you're following this journey through the Japanese collective psyche, comment below with your thoughts on how different cultures respond to collective trauma. Share this video with anyone interested in history or psychology, because we're just beginning to unravel the deeper layers of this fascinating historical moment. What was unfolding in that critical moment extended far beyond a mere military defeat. It was what Jung would describe as the dark night of the soul of an entire nation, that moment of complete dissolution that precedes any possibility of rebirth. The American fleet, with its seemingly supernatural power, had become a numinous symbol, charged with transcendental psychic energy that acted directly upon the Japanese collective unconscious. Japan's ancient samurai tradition, with its emphasis on honorable death in the face of inevitable defeat, was about to face its ultimate test. As the weeks passed, the constant presence of that impossible fleet on the Japanese horizon began to produce what Jung would call a transformation of the psychic libido. The collective psychic energy, unable to find external expression through military victory, turned inward, generating remarkable psychological phenomena. Documents from the era report waves of visionary experiences among the civilian population, from prophetic dreams to collective hallucinations. A particularly significant phenomenon was recorded in Kure, an important naval base. Dozens of people reported seeing the spirit of Amaterasu weeping over the harbor waters. From a Jungian perspective, these manifestations represent what he would call psychic compensation. When consciousness reaches an extreme state of imbalance, the unconscious produces powerful symbols in an attempt to restore harmony. A Japanese military doctor, Dr. Tanaka, left fascinating records of the behavioral changes he observed among soldiers and civilians during this period. It's as if the entire population was simultaneously undergoing a profound psychic transformation, he wrote. The bravest men succumb to absolute despair, while the most fragile demonstrate an inexplicable serenity. Old certainties crumble, and new forms of understanding emerge that fit no known category. What the doctor was describing, unknowingly, was what Jung would identify as a process of forced collective individuation, the painful integration of previously unconscious aspects into collective consciousness. The Japanese concept of gaman, the stoic capacity to endure the unbearable, was being tested beyond its limits. Jung helps us understand this phenomenon in psychology and religion when he writes, "Suffering that exceeds human capacity to bear it transforms either into pathology or into transcendence. For many Japanese, this psychic crossroads manifested in surprising ways." An American military report from that era observed with perplexity that even under intense bombing, certain Japanese social rituals remained intact. Teachers continued to hold graduation ceremonies in partially destroyed schools. Families maintained the practice of obon, honoring ancestors. This apparent contradiction reveals what Jung would call the transcendent function, the psychic capacity to simultaneously hold irreconcilable opposites, generating a third possibility that transcends both. The story of Keiko Yamada, a 17-year-old girl who lost her entire family in the bombings, exemplifies this transformation. In her diary, she wrote, "Today I saw those metal monsters in the sky again, but for the first time I felt no hatred, just a strange clarity. It's as if my previous life was a dream from which I finally awoke." This account reflects what Jung would describe as enantiodromia, the principle that any psychic extreme eventually transforms into its opposite. Absolute terror, taken to its extreme, transformed into a particular form of liberation. If you're wondering how such psychic transformations were possible under such extreme conditions, Jung offers us an answer in Man and His Symbols. The psyche possesses autonomous healing resources that activate precisely when all conscious hopes are exhausted. The Ghost Fleet, ironically, had created the conditions for a profound psychic revolution in Japan. Statistics from this period reveal disconcerting patterns. While suicide rates dramatically increased among military officers, over 1,000 documented cases in the final months of the war, there was a simultaneous decline in psychosomatic illnesses among civilians in the most heavily bombed areas. Jung would explain this apparent paradox through the concept of a hierarchy of complexes. When an absolutely dominant psychic complex, in this case immediate survival, takes control, other secondary complexes temporarily dissolve. Tell me in the comments which part of Japan you'd like to know more about during this extraordinary period. Your feedback helps us shape the next videos in this series. It's important to observe the singular phenomenon emerging in Japanese military communications. Official reports, previously characterized by rigid, formalized optimism, began to incorporate poetic and almost mystical elements. A naval commander, in his last communication before ritual suicide, wrote, "The enemy ships are like mountains walking upon the waters. We are like cherry blossoms before the storm." This transformation in language reflects what Jung would identify as the emergence of symbolic thought. When rational structures of consciousness fail, the older, more primordial symbolic mode of cognition reasserts control. At the epicenter of this collective psychic transformation, what we might call in Jungian terms, the confrontation with the archetype of the apocalypse occurred. The American Ghost Fleet didn't just represent a superior military force. It had become a symbol of the end of an era. When air attacks reached their peak, with over 1,500 aircraft simultaneously dropping bombs over Japanese territory, the experience transcended mere physical destruction. Witnesses describe a disturbing phenomenon. The entire sky seemed to have vanished, replaced by a living, pulsating metallic ceiling. "It was as if the very heavens had transformed into an alien entity," wrote a Tokyo survivor. "It wasn't just fear we felt, it was a kind of terrible reverence." This description corresponds precisely to what Jung would define as a numinous experience, the encounter with something so absolutely other that it defies existing categories of the mind. It's at this critical point that we observe the clearest emergence of what Jung would call the polarization of the collective psyche. On one side, an ultra-nationalist military faction formed, willing to fight to the last man, woman, and child, an extreme manifestation of the archetype of heroic death. On the other, a movement towards surrender and transformation silently emerged, representing the archetype of metamorphosis. This division wasn't just political. It represented a deep schism within the Japanese collective unconscious itself. The case of nuclear physicist Yoshio Nishina vividly illustrates this moment of transformation. After witnessing the effects of the bombings in Tokyo, he wrote in his diary, "Today I understood that there is a fundamental difference between intellectually knowing the destructive power of a force and experiencing it with body and soul. This understanding cannot be communicated in words. What Nishina was describing, without using Jungian terminology, was the difference between knowledge as conscious content and understanding as an integrative experience involving all layers of the psyche. Statistics from this period reveal fascinating patterns that illuminate the collective mental state. While documented cases of acute psychosis surprisingly decreased, a 37% decline in bombed urban areas, there was a dramatic increase in phenomena of somatic conversion, especially temporary blindness and deafness without identifiable organic cause. Jung would explain this phenomenon through the concept of protective dissociation, when the psyche, unable to consciously integrate an overwhelming experience, shifts psychic energy to somatic manifestations. The profound irony of this historical moment would not escape a Jungian analysis. Japan, which had launched itself into war in the name of its spiritual superiority, now faced the most intense spiritual crisis of its modern history. What began as an extreme affirmation of the Japanese collective persona, the social mask of invulnerability, culminated in a brutal confrontation with its collective shadow, absolute vulnerability. A Zen monk who survived the bombings of Osaka offers a glimpse into this transformation in his memoirs. "When the planes came, I sought refuge in the temple. The walls collapsed around me. For a moment, I experienced what we call kensho, a glimpse into the true nature of reality. I understood that Japan, as I knew it, was just a temporary mental construct." This experience reflects what Jung would call positive dissolution, when rigid psychic structures disintegrate, opening space for new, more integrated configurations. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos in this series, exploring the psychic transformations of nations in critical historical moments. Particularly significant was the transformation in the Japanese people's relationship with the figure of the emperor. Before the war, Hirohito was literally considered a living divinity, a central dogma of Japanese collective consciousness. As the Ghost Fleet demonstrated its undeniable supremacy, the first silent questions about this divinity emerged. An imperial palace official recorded secret conversations where, for the first time, the possibility of the emperor being just human was discussed. In Jungian terminology, we were witnessing the dissolution of an archetypal projection, the process by which unconscious contents, in this case the archetype of the God King, are projected onto external figures and then, under pressure from reality, gradually reintegrated into consciousness. A peculiar phenomenon emerged in dreams reported by Japanese civilians during this period. Several diaries and correspondences document a recurring pattern: dreams where the dreamer encounters ancestors appearing dressed in Western clothes or speaking English. Jung would interpret these dreams as attempts by the collective unconscious to build symbolic bridges to integrate the impending trauma, suggesting that Japanese identity could survive through transformation, not annihilation. These dreams represent what he would call the compensatory function of the unconscious, the psyche's capacity to spontaneously produce symbols that balance unilateral attitudes of consciousness. As the Ghost Fleet's siege intensified, a profound transformation occurred in what Jung would call the typical attitude of Japanese collective consciousness. Traditionally oriented towards extroverted martial heroism, the national psyche began to turn inward in an expression of what Jung would identify as the compensatory inferior function. In this case, a contemplative introversion that had been repressed during militaristic fervor. A notable example of this phenomenon was documented on the most remote islands of the Japanese archipelago, where entire communities, isolated from official communications, spontaneously developed purification rituals that combined traditional Shinto elements with new symbolic forms. Anthropologists who studied these rituals decades later discovered that they contained elements that symbolically anticipated national surrender and transformation. The diary of Ichiro Hatoyama, a mid-ranking Imperial Army officer, offers a fascinating glimpse into this psychic transformation. Today, observing the American fleet on the horizon, I realize that what we are facing is not just a superior military force, but something deeper. It's as if we are standing before a mirror that reveals our true condition. For the first time, I clearly see what we have become. This account exemplifies what Jung would call the withdrawal of projections, the painful process by which psychic contents projected onto the external world are recognized as part of the self. The American enemy, previously demonized as inferior and barbaric, was now recognized as bearing qualities that Japan itself had denied within itself. Military statistics from this period reveal a disconcerting pattern that illuminates this process of psychic transformation. While kamikaze attacks increased in frequency, reaching over 300 missions in a single day, their effectiveness drastically decreased. Modern analysts calculate that the success rate of these attacks fell from approximately 28% in the initial stages to less than 5% in the final months. Jung would interpret this phenomenon as evidence that the symbolic gesture had become empty. The psychic energy that initially animated these sacrifices had redirected itself toward internal processes of transformation. Particularly revealing was the transformation in cultural production during this period. Tanka poems written in the final months of the war show a notable shift from themes of heroic sacrifice to reflections on impermanence and the beauty of desolation. An anonymous poet wrote, "Metal ships on the horizon, like autumn clouds, announcing the end, not just of the war, but of who we thought we were." This aesthetic evolution reflects what Jung would call the symbolic elaboration of trauma, the psyche's capacity to transform devastating experiences into artistic expressions that facilitate integration. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung writes that true transformation occurs not when we try to transcend our condition, but when we accept it completely. We can observe this principle in action in letters exchanged between Japanese officers in the final months of the war. The language gradually shifts from a rhetoric of impossible victory to expressions of acceptance of fate that simultaneously preserve and transform traditional values like giri, obligation, and debt of gratitude. A naval commander wrote, "I understand now that our true obligation is not to win, but to bear witness, to be the eyes that clearly see what is happening so that something of us may survive the destruction." If you're following this series on collective psychic transformations, share it with someone you know who's interested in depth psychology or world history. The situation of Japanese children during this period offers a particularly revealing prism for understanding the national psychic transformation. Researchers documented an extraordinary phenomenon. Amidst the bombings, children in various cities spontaneously developed games that simulated not Japanese victory, but defeat and subsequent rebirth. An observer described children playing reconstruction amidst still smoking ruins. Jung would see in these games the manifestation of the death and rebirth archetype spontaneously emerging from the collective unconscious to prepare the psyche for the imminent transformation. As he observes in Man and His Symbols, the child, not yet fully socialized, remains closer to the collective unconscious and often expresses its contents with a clarity that adults have lost. Jung's work, Symbols of Transformation, helps us understand the broader psychological phenomenon occurring. The psychic energy, libido, that was previously channeled into imperial expansion and martial heroism was being forcibly redirected. This redirection was not just a matter of politics or strategy, but a profound reorganization of the very structure of the Japanese collective psyche. The impending defeat at the hands of the Ghost Fleet had initiated what Jung would call a process of collective individuation, the painful path toward the integration of previously denied aspects of national identity. Particularly notable was the transformation in the attitude toward death. Traditional samurai culture had glorified death in battle as the supreme form of honor. In the final months of the war, diaries and letters reveal a subtle but profound shift, the valorization not of heroic death, but of meaningful survival. A kamikaze officer who survived when his mission was aborted wrote, "I realize today that there is more courage in living through defeat than in dying to avoid it." This transformation reflects what Jung would identify as the emergence of the survivor archetype, one who carries living memory through the apocalypse. At the same time, Japanese authorities faced an unprecedented crisis in maintaining the national collective persona. Official documents from this period show a fascinating dissonance. Externally, the rhetoric of inevitable victory continued, while internally, detailed preparations for surrender were already underway. Jung would help us understand this apparent contradiction through the concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to simultaneously hold irreconcilable opposites until a new synthesis emerges. The psychic legacy of the ghost fleet in the Japanese collective mind did not end with formal surrender. What we are witnessing, from a Jungian perspective, is the beginning of a process of integration of the collective shadow that would continue to unfold for generations. When Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender over the radio on August 15, 1945, what Jung would describe as a moment of conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, occurred. For the first time in Japanese history, the divine voice of the emperor reached the ears of common subjects directly, an event simultaneously sacred and profane that symbolized the dissolution of ancient psychic barriers. Statistics from the period immediately after the surrender reveal the traumatic impact of this collective psychic collapse. Over 500 military officers committed ritual suicide on the day of the announcement, while in the streets of Tokyo, witnesses reported a supernatural silence that hung over the city for days. "It was as if time itself had stopped," wrote an American observer. "It wasn't just the silence of defeat, but the silence of an entire civilization trying to comprehend its new reality." This state corresponds to what Jung would call the alchemical nigredo, the phase of darkness and dissolution that precedes any authentic rebirth. Particularly revealing was the transformation in dream patterns reported by Japanese in the months following the surrender. A study conducted by American psychologists documented a notable prevalence of dreams involving water, oceans, rivers, floods. Jung would interpret these symbols as representations of the collective unconscious in a state of flux, indicating that new psychic structures were forming in the depths of the national psyche. As he observes in Psychology of the Unconscious, water is the most common symbol for the unconscious, representing the fluid and transformative nature of psychic energy. The ensuing American occupation can be understood, in Jungian terms, as a phase of psychic inflation, the forced encounter with a powerful complex that temporarily dominates consciousness. For many Japanese, the physical presence of Americans on sacred soil represented an ontological violation, but simultaneously offered the possibility of what Jung would call an integrative confrontation, the opportunity to recognize denied parts of oneself in the other. A Japanese government official wrote in his memoirs, "We expected monsters, but we found men. This discovery was perhaps more unsettling than any imagined atrocity." Japan's physical reconstruction in the following decades mirrored a parallel process of psychic reconstruction. The Japanese economic miracle can be understood, through a Jungian lens, as a form of collective sublimation, the channeling of psychic energy previously invested in martial ideals toward new goals of productivity and technical excellence. It's no coincidence that Japan became a world leader precisely in technologies related to the sea and electronics, the two domains symbolically associated with the ghost fleet that had transformed its national consciousness. Research on intergenerational trauma offers evidence that the psychic impact of the ghost fleet continues to reverberate in the Japanese collective unconscious. Studies demonstrate distinct patterns of stress response between generations born before and after the war. More significantly, researchers have identified what they call selective cultural amnesia, a phenomenon where certain aspects of historical experience are systematically excluded from conscious narrative, only to reappear transformed in cultural expressions like cinema, literature, and art. The kaiju, giant monster genre in Japanese cinema, exemplified by Godzilla, can be interpreted as a symbolic manifestation of nuclear trauma and the overwhelming power of the ghost fleet. Emerging from the collective unconscious in transformed form. If you're enjoying this Jungian analysis of transformative historical moments, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. As Jung observed in Civilization in Transition, the greatest and most significant catastrophes are essentially psychic in their origin. Japan's encounter with the American ghost fleet represents a paradigmatic case of this profound truth. It wasn't just American material superiority that defeated Japan, but the internal collapse of a psychic structure that could no longer sustain its fundamental contradictions. The fleet served as the external catalyst for a transformation that, in a way, was already latent in the Japanese collective unconscious. The phenomenon of the hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings, offers a particularly revealing prism for understanding this ongoing transformation. Many hibakusha report an experience that transcends physical trauma, describing a form of psychic death and rebirth. A Hiroshima survivor wrote, "After the flash, I was no longer the same person. Something died, something was born. I carry both death and life within me." This experience encapsulates what Jung would call the transcendence of trauma, the paradoxical capacity of the psyche to find meaning and renewal even in the most complete devastation. It's important to recognize that the psychic legacy of the ghost fleet isn't limited to Japan. Americans who served in that naval force often report a peculiar phenomenon that Jung would immediately recognize: the feeling of having participated in something that transcends rational comprehension, a numinous event carrying mythical qualities. An American sailor wrote in his memoirs, "Sometimes, looking back, it seems impossible that we were truly part of it. It was as if we were instruments of some greater force." This perception reflects what Jung would call mystical participation, the intuitive recognition of being involved in an archetypal process that transcends personal history. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the ghost fleet in the Japanese psyche is what Jung would call cultural enantiodromia, the principle that any extreme position eventually transforms into its opposite. Japan, which had embraced an ethos of imperial domination and racial superiority, emerged from the trauma as a defender of constitutional pacifism. This transformation doesn't just represent a political shift, but a profound reorganization of archetypal values in the collective unconscious. As Jung reminds us in Man and His Symbols, what you resist persists, what you accept transforms you. Japan's encounter with the American ghost fleet forced a confrontation with denied aspects of its collective psyche, initiating a process of transformation that continues to this day, a process that isn't just about reconstruction, but about true national individuation.